Thank you so much, Venerable Vimala and Anna-Marie. And it's so good to see people from all around the world here today for this session. So yes, my name is Bhante Akaliko and I use the pronouns he, him. And today I'm coming to you from Barramadagal land of the Darug Nation here in Harris Park, Sydney, Australia. So for those people who don't know this custom we have in Australia of acknowledging country. So this is a colonized land. And so we usually begin a session just by acknowledging this land and acknowledging the elders, past, present and future of the Barramadagal people, and that this land was never ceded. This is stolen land and always will be Aboriginal land. So this acknowledgement actually, I was thinking in the context of spiritual bypassing, is a good example of the kind of thing we're going to be exploring through this workshop. Because, you know, we live in a colonized land, we're aware that the land wasn't stolen. So there's something at the back of our mind that maybe unless we bring it out, we're not really aware of the impact. We're not really aware of the distress and the harm that it has caused. This is somewhat similar to the kind of things we're going to be exploring today and tomorrow in this workshop on spiritual bypassing, which really is all about how to avoid pitfalls, how to avoid not seeing clearly, not knowing what we're doing in our practice, in our spiritual life, not knowing when we're hurting ourselves or harming others, and bringing some clarity to our spiritual practice. So that's the aim of the session. And I was just looking at the session outline that Anna-Marie put up, and I'm freaking out a little bit because there's a lot to do. There's a lot to cover, and I hope that we'll get through as much of it as we can. But I'd just like to start off by saying I'm so happy to see so many people here who are interested in this topic. And quite frequently I have conversations with people when the subject of spiritual bypassing comes up. And when I tell them a little bit about it, they say, oh yeah, that's me, that's what I do. Or, oh yeah, I've definitely done that in the past, or I've got the potential to do that. And so it's something that is actually a really important thing for us to reflect upon. This is the point of this workshop, is I want to encourage you and me to become a reflective spiritual practitioner, someone who examines our spiritual life, that sees it clearly, that wants to understand the way our mind works, wants to understand the way we're interacting with others, the way we're walking our spiritual path, and to see it so clearly that we develop some wisdom around it. So I'm going to try to share my screen and hopefully it will work. Oop. And so I'm going to be presenting a slideshow. And so I hope you can see that. Yes, I think you can. So this is the beginning of the workshop. So welcome. And here we have an image that I really love, which is a woman with her fingers in her ears and her eyes closed. So this is my touchstone for the session of spiritual bypassing. This is what spiritual bypassing looks like. If someone with their eyes closed to the world, refusing to look, someone with their fingers in their ears, refusing to listen. This is the opposite of what the Buddha wanted us to do. The Buddha wanted us to see clearly, to see reality clearly, to understand, to know, to not hide away from the suffering of the world, the defilements of our mind, problems of ethics, morality. When we close our eyes to the world, we're missing out on an opportunity for understanding, to see wisdom growing in ourselves. And so this is the starting point I want to start with today, this idea of closed eyes, not seeing, refusing to look. So you're all here today because you are spiritual. You're spiritual people. You're interested in spirituality, which is wonderful. But how do we make sure that we're doing the right thing in our spiritual practice? How do we know that we're following the path correctly? How do we know that we're not just being quote unquote spiritual? And I think this is an important thing for us to consider, because sometimes this label of spiritual confers a way of seeing ourselves that might not be in accordance with the way others see us or with reality. Sometimes when we think of ourselves as spiritual, it might give us a sense of superiority. Or maybe we might think that we are inferior, that we're less than other people, that other people are much higher than us, that they know more than us, that they have more wisdom or more experience. Or maybe we think that everyone is the same, just the same as me, exactly at the same spot on the spiritual path as I am. But these three ways of seeing, this superiority, inferiority, or the same, these are three types of conceit that the Buddha identified, saying that these things are not true. We are neither superior, we are neither inferior, and we are not the same as other people. And so this is something that we should be aware of when it comes to thinking about our own spiritual path. We're not going to be able to do exactly the same thing as others. We're not going to be able to imitate people from the past. We are neither better nor worse than anyone else. And our spiritual path is going to have to be personal to us, specific to us. It's not something we're just going to be able to generalize about. So I like using images. I'm a visual person, and the Buddha also used a lot of images in his teaching. He used a lot of similes. And I think for people at the time of the Buddha, this was a very powerful way to make very simple teachings known and understood very clearly. He used similes that were easy to comprehend, easy to understand. And these similes still have power today. And so I'm going to be using, as we go along, I'm going to be using some images, I'm going to be using some memes, and I'm going to be relating them to parts of spiritual bypassing and Buddhist practice generally. So here we have an image of a person holding a snake by the tail. On the left and on the right, we have a tool that's being used to keep the snake down by the head. And some of you who know your Buddhist suttas, the teachings of the Buddha, will already know where this is going. And this is the simile of the snake. This is a sutta where the Buddha talks about how to perceive the teachings that he gives. And he says, suppose there was a person in need of a snake, which might sound a bit weird, but sometimes people need snakes. Suppose there was a person in need of a snake, and while wandering in search of a snake, they'd seen a big snake, and they grasp it by the coil or by the tail. But that snake would twist back and bite them on the hand or on the arm or limb, resulting in death or deadly pain. Why is that? Because of their wrong grasp of the snake. In the same way, the Buddha says, a foolish person who memorizes the teachings, they don't examine the meaning of these teachings with wisdom, and so they don't come to a considered acceptance of them. They just memorize the teaching for the sake of finding fault and winning debates. They don't realize the goal for which they memorize them. Because they're wrongly grasped, those teachings lead to their lasting harm and suffering. Why is that? Because of their wrong grasp of the teachings. So here we have the Buddha saying, don't misunderstand me. And perhaps for many of you here today, you have some doubts about your practice. I know this comes into my mind quite frequently. It's very easy to read a sutta or to see a quote or to hear a teaching and not grasp it correctly, not understand it in the way that it was intended. And doubt will come into your mind. And doubt is, of course, a big hindrance. It's going to cause problems because you're not sure of what is correct, what is true. You're not sure of the path that you want to follow. You're not sure of the way to practice your spirituality. And so it's comforting for me to realize that this was a problem also at the time of the Buddha, that some people misunderstood, that some people perhaps misused the teachings, but that they were able to, through contact with good teachers, good people, learn, they're able to progress, and that they were able to perhaps even attain enlightenment. And so even though the spiritual path can from time to time be confusing, or we might take a wrong turn, or we might miss the point, or you might misconstrue, we still have the potential to grow and learn. But this depends on us seeing ourselves clearly. It's much better to see that you have problems, that you have misunderstandings, that you are wrong. It's much better to know that than it is to think that you're perfect, that you've got no problems, or even to think that you don't have a clue, that you've got no progress on the path at all. And so when it comes to our spiritual practice, it's always much better to know that you've got a problem so that you can deal with it. This is very much in line with what spiritual bypassing is all about. And so, we come towards spiritual bypassing as a topic that was created, actually coined, by this gentleman here, John Welwood, who's passed away a few years back. And he wrote this book, Towards a Psychology of Awakening. So he was a psychologist, a psychotherapist, and he gave this definition of spiritual bypassing. Spiritual bypassing is a term I coined to describe a process I saw happening in the Buddhist community that I was in. Although most of us were sincerely trying to work on ourselves, I noticed a widespread tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. When we are spiritually bypassing, we often use the goal of awakening or liberation to rationalize what I call premature transcendence, trying to rise above the raw and messy side of our humanness before we have fully faced and made peace with it. So John Welwood gave this, this very strong definition, and the feature that I remember encountering when I read this definition that mattered to me most was this idea of premature transcendence, this idea of people thinking that they are much further along the spiritual path than they actually are. And we're going to explore that in detail tomorrow. But it was John Welwood who started this idea that maybe people were using their spiritual practice in an unhelpful way, an unhealthy way. They were misusing it, misconstruing, and that this was actually leading to harm. And so this is something worth considering. Like, how do I practice my spirituality? Is it leading to more wholesome states, or is it leading to unwholesome states? And this is the benchmark that the Buddha himself used when he was talking about the spiritual path. the conditions, the teachers we have, the community we are with. He said, make sure that your mind is inclining towards more wholesome states, not developing unwholesome states. And this is a measure of progress on the path. We want to see that we're developing more wholesome states. We want to know that we're letting go of unwholesome states. So I'm going to keep coming in and out of sharing slides, so please forgive the slight delay. The next person who took up the banner of spiritual bypassing was Robert Augustus Masters. And he really fleshed out and more carefully defined what spiritual bypassing is. And I was horrified to learn that Robert Masters was actually a cult leader, and in the 70s and 80s and early 90s, and that he was criticized for mistreating women, for being manipulative, for taking drugs and doing all of this kind of naughty stuff. And I remember thinking, I don't know if I can believe a single word this person says. But later he became a psychologist and trained and became a practicing psychologist, and then wrote these books about looking at the shadow side of spirituality. And I think that this is important as well to acknowledge for ourselves, is that we have the capacity for both unwholesome actions and wholesome actions, that we have this part of ourself that might not be great, that we might need to work on, parts of ourselves that might be undesirable, parts of ourselves that might be shameful. There might be parts of ourselves that hurt others. And doesn't mean that we can't be a spiritual person. Doesn't mean that we can't work on those problems and come out of those behaviors. When someone does that, that's praiseworthy. And so someone like Robert Masters, I'm not sure, I've never met him. I hope that he's worked on the problems that he has. And I think that this is something with current cultures of cancel culture and things like that, we need to be able to allow people to grow. And if they acknowledge their mistakes, then that's a good thing. And if we can acknowledge our mistakes too and try better, then that is the spiritual path. And so Robert Masters, he defined spiritual bypassing in 10 different factors, which I'll share with you because this is the basis for this workshop. So he said, spiritual bypassing is an unacknowledged, persistent shadow side of spirituality. The first factor he identified is exaggerated detachment. And I'll just quickly go through this list and then we'll look at these in detail. The second, emotional numbing and repression. Hyperpositivity, anger phobia, blind, overly tolerant compassion, weak boundaries. These are the 6 factors that we'll be looking at today. And then tomorrow, lopsided development. This is usually the cognitive over the emotional. A debilitating judgment about our shadow self, those things that I was just talking about. Devaluing the personal relative to the spiritual. And a delusion of being attained or enlightened. So these are the 10 areas that we're going to be looking at. And I just want to add a few more into the mix, which are a kind of expansion of spiritual bypassing that's been done in the last few years, especially by people of colour and queer people, looking at how their sanghas and Buddhist communities sometimes spiritually bypass in a way that is actually cultural. For example, just last year there was Black Lives Matter protests, and you heard a lot of Buddhists saying that all lives matter. And of course, this misses the point of things like racial bias, white privilege, white Buddhism, and alt-right Buddhism, which, believe it or not, is a thing. And we might also hear people say things like gender doesn't matter. And this, of course, misses things like patriarchy, misogyny, inequality, the reality of Me Too and violence towards women. Sometimes we hear our communities say that because we've got this doctrine in Buddhism of not self, that means that if you have an identity or engage in identity politics, then you must be a bad Buddhist. And this sometimes leads to things like erasure of the queer community within our Buddhist communities, and discrimination, and not understanding how prejudice works, and that many queer people still face violence. Or you might hear things like, you can't change the world, which might be true, but at the same time, we are changing the world all the time. So there's a lot of information that I've just thrown at you. So there's a lot that we're going to be unpacking today and exploring. One way that I want to do this is to allow you to have chats with other people in this call so that you can kind of connect and maybe ask a few questions of your own and explore them in a conversation. There's probably, I think I've just got one more slide, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of actually what this is we're talking about. This is all kind of contextualizing background kind of stuff. So both John Wellwood and Robert Masters are psychologists, and people might complain that this is not Buddhism. These are not the suttas of the Buddha, that this is not the commentaries of Buddhist communities from the past, that these people aren't even good teachers, enlightened teachers. And I think this is a bit of a straw man. One thing about psychology is that psychologists are trained to look for tendencies that we might be blind to in ourselves, and they gently guide us to an understanding. And this is something that I think is really important in our spiritual practice. Often we're quite alone in the world. We don't have a close spiritual teacher near us. We don't have people that we can talk to about our spirituality. For many of us on this call, we might be the only people interested in Buddhism that we know. We might not feel like we belong to a community. We access teachings online. We access teachings through books or videos. We might not know about how the relationship with the teacher actually is a personal relationship on the spiritual path that helps us grow, because that teacher sees us as an individual and helps us. They see the problems that we need to work on, and they point us in the right direction. This is something that I was very fortunate to have as a monk, always having good teachers around me who could see my mind, see my flaws, see my good qualities, and help me in the right direction. And so with psychology, it's something that you do in the presence of another. When you're working with a psychologist or a therapist or a counselor, you're working with them. And it's important that they see you and that you are seen by them. And so I think that psychology has a place, and psychological ideas have a place. And we are people who can benefit from exploring the things that psychology can show us. And I think there's a danger too in only wanting our spiritual practice to be this 2,500-year-old texts from the Buddha, and thinking that these things alone would be enough of an instruction manual to live our life today. Things have changed from the Buddhist time. And as an analogy of this change, I'll just continue the theme of snakes by telling you the cure in Buddhist texts for snake bites. And this might seem a bit weird, but hopefully it will make sense in a second. So if we were sick and we got, if we got bitten by a snake and were sick, would you use this recipe? First one is feces, which is poo. Second one is urine, to make it nice and, I guess, drinkable. And then there's ashes, and then there's mud. So medicine has moved on since the time of the Buddha. Technology has moved on since the time of the Buddha. Here we are connected to each other all around the world. And I guess also in a way, psychology has moved on from the time of the Buddha, that our minds are probably not the same kind of minds as people might have had in those small villages in India 2,500 years ago. Of course, the general tendency of the mind is the same, but the way we understand our world is necessarily going to be different. The way we make sense of the Buddhist teachings in our world is going to be different to the way people made sense of them at the time of the Buddha. We can't just think that the Buddha provided an instruction manual for all the aspects of our life. There's so many problems today that we face that people at the time of the Buddha didn't have. And so this is something to consider, how we look at our teachings. How do we make sure that we put them into practice in an authentic way? And the reason for bringing this up is to point out that the teachings themselves don't have any wisdom in them. And I'm stealing this line from Bhante Sujato, my teacher, who said this at a talk that I was at. He said, the teachings don't have any wisdom in them. And I was like, this is a scandalous thing to say. How dare you? What kind of monk would say that? But then he continued and he pointed out that where wisdom is in you and your understanding of the teachings. Otherwise, it's just a book. Otherwise, it's just words. Otherwise, it's just something you chant. If it doesn't mean anything, if it isn't incorporated into your practice, if it isn't part of your heart, if it isn't understood deeply and profoundly and put into practice, then it doesn't matter. It just remains an abstract idea. And so in the same way that we might not just rely upon the medicine from the time of the Buddha or the technology from the time of the Buddha, we can use the teachings of the Buddha, and we can also add another layer of complexity, another layer of understanding, which applies to us here now with our own minds. And so that's why I think these principles of spiritual bypassing have a place in our spiritual practice. I hope that makes sense. So we better keep going so we don't run out of time. And let's hope we don't get bitten by a snake, eh? So the reason this is important to me is, as a Buddhist, I want to make sure that I'm being an authentic practitioner. I want to see myself clearly. I want to make sure that I'm using my spiritual practice to uncover the parts of myself that I need to work on. And one problem with being a spiritual person is that sometimes we might feel like we have to perform a spirituality, that we might have to cover up our true, actual feelings and put on a smiling, happy Buddhist face. This is something that I see a lot in spiritual circles. It's people not being their authentic self, not looking at themselves clearly, because they've been told that these parts of themselves are maybe not spiritual or are undesirable or should be covered up or are shameful or aren't Buddhist. And so then we have this kind of performance of what it means to be a Buddhist, which can be very narrow and very limited and can end up making us perhaps repress and suppress our true feelings. And if we don't acknowledge them, if we don't understand who we really are, then how can we possibly work on those things? How can we possibly move forward on the spiritual path? It's so important to remember that we need to know where we are on the spiritual path. How can we get where we're going if we don't know where we are? And how can we get where we're going if we're not sure of what the path is? So spiritual bypassing is a term that describes not being where we need to be, being somewhere else, missing where we need to go, getting lost, taking a wrong turn, wandering off. For many people, we have this idealized version of what the spiritual path is. It's a straight line that just keeps on getting better and better, going up and up and up. But for many of us, we realize that our spiritual journey is quite messy and take many wrong turns, many different, I had so many different traditions that I studied under, different teachers. I was interested in all sorts of things before I kind of found the path that worked for me. And I think that's what it means to have a spiritual journey. But we shouldn't discount the messiness of our journey. We shouldn't just expect that our journey is going to be simple or clear all the time. It's going to be complex. It's going to be messy. And that's okay. But we want to make sure that we're progressing at least. So that idea of a spiritual path, maybe you can see in this slide, the highway going underneath the loop. I mean, that could be a metaphor for the Noble Eightfold Path of the Buddha, the straight and narrow path that's going to take us to our destination. But if we're not careful, if we're not aware, if we're not clear, and if we don't reflect and examine our spiritual practice, it's very easy for us to take the wrong turn and to end up going round in circles or being shot off into a different direction. And so this is what it means to spiritually bypass. The work that we need to do is right there in the middle. But if we're not careful, we'll miss the work that we need to do. And this image is the image of transformation, the idea of becoming a spiritual person, a spiritual being, and the process that occurs. And I wanted to point out this process because what happens to that little caterpillar inside the cocoon is a total rearrangement of its body. It literally liquefies and turns itself inside out, organs move, and it's an incredible change. It's an incredible transformation. And it's one that is a kind of collapse, one that is kind of a, I guess that turning inside out. This is what it means to transform. It's not going to be an easy process on the spiritual path. It's going to be full of things that are difficult, problems. We're going to have to turn ourselves inside out from time to time to see ourselves clearly. And lastly, spiritual path is not a band-aid solution. Spiritual path is a way to really fix fundamentally the problems we have in life. And when we're spiritually bypassing, what we're going to be doing is usually just applying a band-aid. We're not going to be able to make deep, meaningful change, the kind of change we need to heal, to grow in our spiritual practice. So what we're going to do from now on is we're going to be looking at each of the factors of spiritual bypassing, and we're going to be looking at it through some memes and some little illustrations that I'm going to put to you. And it's going to be quite quick. And I want to discuss the relationship to Buddhist thought, and especially the origin of these ideas and how they might perhaps lead us astray from time to time, how we can avoid them, and then we're going to have some discussions about them. So finally, we arrive at the first of these factors, and this is exaggerated detachment. This is something that Robert Masters identified as a problem. What does it look like? I have equanimity to everything. I don't read the news. I'm above worldly concerns. Other people can't hurt or help me. The world is just pain, so detach. People who say, I live like a hermit, I'm an island, I don't need anyone. People who say that politics and social issues are not spiritual. Or I have a protective aura around me that I use to filter out negativity. So one of the problems with these ways of thinking is like meditation just becomes an escape from reality. We use spirituality and meditation as a coping mechanism. Or spirituality disguises our poor social skills or poor mental health and becomes a way for us to justify not interacting with the world by social isolation, turning away. And often these people require, people who think like this, require retreat-like conditions to practice. And I'll talk about that in a second. What does it look like? Let's get some visuals here. This is what it looks like to have this kind of exaggerated detachment, like you brick yourself away from the world. You build up, and hopefully many people can relate to this. Maybe you know people like this, or perhaps this is how we deal with others ourselves. We put up a wall so that we won't get hurt by others, so that we can stay safe. This is quite a common idea. You see this quite a lot these days, people saying, no one can hurt you if you detach yourself from everything and avoid becoming emotionally invested in anyone. Or we distract ourselves. We kind of create our own world for ourselves and we disassociate. And this can make our existence feel very isolated and sometimes meaningless. And as my teacher Bhante Sujato said, with COVID, we are all Rapunzel now. And so, of course, the introverts are loving it. The extroverts, the social butterflies, it's really hard for them. The hermit life is the good life, says Rapunzel. So, exaggerated detachment. The hermit life is the good life. Where does this come from, this idea that we need to be completely cut off from the world? We need to be solitary, detached, dwelling alone in the forest? Well, it comes from the Buddhist texts. We know that the Buddha often talked about solitude, and he talked about going to those empty places in the forest to practice meditation. Who was he talking to? Was he talking to the general population? most of the time, he was talking to people who were living the holy life, people who were ordained as monastics, who were renunciants. But he cautioned against going to the forest to dwell by yourself before you were ready. And for this reason, the Buddha recommended asking your teacher before you go to the forest. And there's a story about the Buddha being attended by a particular monk, and the monk said to him, I want to go and spend some time in the forest alone in solitude. And the Buddha was like, oh, you shouldn't do that. And he said, no, I'm going to go and do it. And the Buddha was like, oh, you really shouldn't do that. And third time, and then the Buddha was like, okay, go away. And so then this poor monk had a horrible time meditating. He wasn't ready to be alone in the forest. But we have this kind of romanticized ideal sometimes of spiritual practice, that monks and nuns are dwelling alone in the forest, and that we too can be kind of like a hermit, and that this is the ultimate way to practice, that this is the way that we're going to get far on the spiritual path. But in reality, the Buddhist monastics are always dependent upon community. They're never far from a community. Even at the time of the Buddha, they dwelt nearby the village because they had to go for alms to the village. They weren't dwelling all the time in solitude. They were spending part of the day in solitude, and as the Buddha encouraged, coming together frequently to meet, to discuss the Dhamma, to listen to teachings. Often they would have been with teachers, they would have been seen, they would have been part of a community. And so sometimes we can overemphasize this solitude as part of our practice and kind of glamorize this stepping away from the world. And just remember that the spiritual bypass is where this is premature, where we might turn away from the world before we're ready, or where we might think that we should spend, all day or night in solitude practicing meditation, but that's not where we're at with our spiritual path. We actually need to work on other aspects of our life. We don't use this spirituality as a way to hide from the world, to cover up our lack of social contact, or where we might perhaps think that people are difficult, relationships are difficult, and the world is difficult, so the only way to deal with it is to not deal. It's kind of like that, covering our eyes and pretending that we're not here. And so this is dangerous if we aren't going to see the motivation for spending time in solitude. For a lot of people, they're lonely. A lot of people don't have a sense of community. And so this is something that can happen sometimes, that we start to think that this is the way we should be if we're going to be spiritual. Just turn our back on our friends, our family. And you see this from time to time. I often see that this is a result of people's existing predilection. They're more inclined towards solitude. They're more inclined towards introversion. And so the idea of Buddhism or spiritual practice to them supports that inclination. Whereas other people who might be more gregarious, more social, more outgoing, their version of Buddhism might be more about helping others. Their spiritual practice might be interacting with others. And so we have to be careful sometimes of our motivation or our inclination if we're using something as an excuse, like, we're already quite introverted, and so we think, oh, here's a spiritual practice that looks like me, that supports how I am. And so this is one of the ways that people spiritually bypass. They cut themselves off. They detach from others. And one of the problems with this is that when we are alone, we're not, when we spend a lot of time alone, when we are isolated, when we are detached from others, this is where our version of reality can sometimes start to slip. because there's no one reinforcing the kind of shared reality that we have. And so sometimes you see people on retreats who are spending time in isolation start to go a little bit, they start to become unwell. They start to have delusions. They start to have paranoia and they start to talk to themselves or do weird things because there's no one reinforcing this kind of shared version of reality. They talk to the trees, they see lights, and what we need often in our spiritual practice is to see ourselves in the way that others see us too. So when people start to go off the rails a bit like that, it's a problem, and people will notice that, but the person themselves might not notice. And so this is the problem. We don't really understand how we might be perceived by others. We might not see ourselves clearly. We might not understand that our isolation has started to impact our mental health, our behavior. And isolation and loneliness and exaggerated detachment these are kind of markers of mental health issues as well. And so it's important to maybe look at it. I'm not saying that people should suddenly become social beings if they don't want to, but we should recognize this tendency, because it's not only a physical thing of being detached, it's also an emotional, building that wall between you and others, and only concentrating on yourself, not thinking about others. And this is many missed opportunities on the spiritual path, because we're actually part of a community. And so much of the Buddhist teachings is preparing us to interact with others. And so if we don't interact with others, if we don't see them as part of our spiritual path, then we are not practicing the way the Buddha taught. And so from time to time, of course, spend some time in solitude. From time to time, do a meditation retreat. But don't think that this alone is spiritual, that this alone is a way to lead a spiritual life. So many different ways that we can lead a spiritual life. We don't need to just turn away from the world and become a hermit. So this is linked, of course, to this idea of emotional numbing or repression, which is something that a lot of us do in our daily life, but also in our spiritual practice. One of the reasons is because we've been told by our teachers, that feelings are not real, that they can't be trusted. Or we've been told that feelings are just worldly suffering, that negative emotions like anger or hurt aren't spiritual. Or that spiritual people shouldn't feel anything because they're pure, empty of feelings. We might be told that we should be equanimous at all times, neutral, blank, empty. We might feel that we need to repress our thoughts, repress our desires, or even repress our needs. And here we have a situation where we kind of use willpower to force our mind and body to submit. Many people genuinely believe that happiness is not a part of the spiritual life, only suffering is. And of course, these things are often linked to chronic depression, to trauma, poor coping mechanisms, which we mistake for spirituality. So this is a good example of that. This is a very famous meme, of course, the poor dog in the fire, saying this is fine, is okay with the events that are currently unfolding. And in the end, of course, doesn't look like it really works out. I was really horrified just recently. I'll see if I can find the article. Whoop. Whoop. I was horrified to see that someone had decided that this meme was actually a spiritual teaching. And in the Lines Raw magazine, which is a really well-known, this is classic spiritual bypassing, by the way. What do a 16th century Zen master and contemporary cartoon dog have in common? Both of them maintained equanimity as their worlds burned. And this is why we train as Buddhists. And it tells the story of a Zen master and his monks getting burnt alive in their monastery. Historical accounts say that not a single monk screamed as they burned to death inside. And even we hear that this Reverend Kwai Seng, Master Kwai Seng, told his monks with a final Dharma talk that this is a critical moment. And when thoughts are quietened down, even flames are cool and refreshing. So I don't know how you feel about that idea that you should just sit there in your burning house and just suppress all of your emotions, suppress all of your desires to escape. And of course, I call this spiritual bypassing because even the story itself doesn't make any sense. We're kind of presented with this teaching that this is like a good thing to repress the desire to live, to repress, genuine fear or emotion. And we're presented with this story and told that this monk gave this Dharma talk and no one survived. And it's like, if no one survived, how do we know what happened? And we don't. And so this is the kind of investigation that sometimes we need to do when we hear things like this. If someone says, suppress your emotions aren't real, and you're kind of like, well, they feel real to me. Well, we need to understand them more deeply. We can sometimes misunderstand how these teachings work. We might believe that if we have feelings that we should get rid of them because they're not spiritual. And this is a problem. This is not real. This is not how the Buddha even taught us to look at these things. So we don't want to be like this dog. This is not a spiritual practice. This is denial and emotional repression, numbing what's actually happening. And of course, you see what happens when you bottle up your negative emotions. Perhaps you've experienced this yourself in your own life. When you bottle up things, it always ends up coming out somewhere. It comes out as anger, or it comes out as hurt or frustration, as frustrated tension in the body or mind. We snap, we yell, because we've been suppressing these things and they've been bottling up, and they're always going to come back and bite us on the bum. So wouldn't it be wonderful if we really, didn't get hurt, if we didn't have feelings, if we could avoid suffering just by turning it off? But the reality, I think, for most of us is that we do have feelings, that we do experience things like anger, hurt, sadness. We need to understand that these feelings are authentic and real. We shouldn't hide them away from ourselves and pretend that they're not there. We shouldn't believe that other people also shouldn't have feelings. Other people shouldn't have anger, sadness. We shouldn't think that this is a way to practice the spiritual path. Because the Buddha actually talked about emotions quite a lot on the spiritual path. So much of the spiritual path is actually about getting in touch with our feelings, getting in touch with our emotions. The spiritual path is one of increasing happiness, increasing bliss, and getting rid of those emotions that disrupt those good states of mind. But how can you get rid of them? You can't get rid of them by suppressing them, by forcing them away, by pretending that they're not there. These things drop off naturally when the conditions and causes are correct. If you are a good person, you do good things, and you look after your morality, your ethics, and you're generous and kind to others, then you'll naturally feel good. You'll naturally feel that the mind is light and happy. You'll have few regrets, and you won't have a lot of remorse. And that's wonderful. When things are going well, feelings, emotions also go well. But when things go wrong, when things get bad, and we feel sad, or we feel depressed, or someone hurts us, or we get angry, or we are frustrated or resentful, this is also part of us. And these also represent opportunities to grow on the spiritual path. These are things that we can acknowledge and that can help us grow. And if we just pretend that they're not there, or if we just try to numb them away, then we're missing an opportunity. But it's a problem that I see so often, that people believe that these things are not spiritual, that when we have these kinds of things, we're not good Buddhists. And that's a problem that we need to address. We need to see these things as part of us, not as something that is foreign to us, that doesn't belong. These things are here, and we need to make sure that we acknowledge them authentically. And so now's a chance to kind of talk about a few of these things. So this is our first breakout session. We might be running, I think we're okay for time. So we're going to spend 15, 20 minutes talking to each other about exaggerated detachment, emotional numbing. And the question that is a focus question for the groups that we're going to go into is, how do we authentically integrate spirituality into our life, rather than using spirituality to hide our real emotions or escape from reality? So these are big topics. Fortunately, we're going to have a few people in our group, so we won't get to discuss them in great detail. But think about your own life. Think about your own spiritual practice. Do you hide your emotions? Do you use spirituality to escape reality? And so in your groups, you have, I think, 4 or 5 people in each group, 4 or 5 minutes to talk. One person can be the leader. Some of the groups will have a facilitator, but we've got many more people in this session than we expected, so not enough facilitators. So some of you just have to go it alone and be brave and talk to each other. Introduce yourself, talk about these things of repression and emotional numbing, escaping from reality, and try to give everyone a chance to speak. If you don't want to speak, it's also okay. No one's obliged. And then we'll come back after about 15 minutes, and then we'll have a comfort break where we can use the bathroom, have a stretch, and things like that. Does that sound okay? Thumbs up? Yeah? Okay, very good. So enjoy the breakout sessions.